Our next speaker is Barry Gold. Barry is a consultant for the ROB Walton Foundation, and he's leading the efforts on large-scale conservation across Africa and ocean protection. With over 20 years in environmental philanthropy, he has held leadership roles with major foundations and served as president of the Biodiversity Funders Group. Previously, he worked in U.S. government agencies and Congress on ecological policy and was recognized with the National Champion of Ocean Award and as a fellow of the AAAS. Please welcome to the podium Barry Gold.
Thank you. What a great place to be. It's my first time. I really appreciate the invitation. It's sort of mind-blowing, right, to think about the challenges that everybody in this room is taking on and the opportunities that they believe that they have to solve it. It reminded me that, de Tocqueville, when he had visited America and he left, he thought the real greatness was that Americans came together and thought there was no problem that they couldn't solve. So you get a few people in the room and they solve a problem. Hopefully that's some of what we're going to do here. And so thank you for these conferences. Before I start, I want to just provide one sort of data point for context of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be focusing on work that we're trying to initiate in Africa in response to things that have been identified by African leaders. But the one thing that I want you to realize is that Africa has the fastest growing population on the planet. So Africa is going to double its population from about 1.3 billion people today to 2.2 billion people by 2050 and 4 billion people by 2100. We anticipate that in 2100, the world population stabilizes at around 10 billion people. So by 2100, Africa will have 40% of the world's population. What we want to talk about is what's going to be needed to support that population. And that's the natural infrastructure that we all depend on, that evolution spent millions of years giving us through design and failure and design and investment of a different kind. And so what we saw in 2022 and 2023 was a recognition by African leaders of the importance of their natural infrastructure. In the Kigali call to action, African leaders recognized that the future for their population depends on healthy ecosystems. So they put out a call to action. They joined the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Protocol. Almost all African leaders signed up to the 30 by 30 pledge. And more recently, 11 African leaders in the Southern African Development Coalition have declared a declaration to protect their Miambo forests. ROB Walton, who's been working in conservation in Africa since 2003, saw these ambitious commitments, and he and Haile Mariam, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, have been working together for years. So in advance of the climate week in New York this year, they wrote an op-ed calling on governments and individuals to come together and finance what we think can be the opportunity to address and respond to the needs of these African leaders. And that is, can we support protected areas in a way that are essential to reduce poverty and build resilient communities, provide food and water security, store carbon, regulate climate, and underpin human well-being of these 4 billion people? In short, the natural infrastructure in Africa supports the future of that country and the future of the planet. So what we're trying to do is create a new initiative that will protect these critical ecosystems, will be focused, will be low overhead, will be targeted, and have measurable outcomes and accountability. And ultimately, will be run by Africans themselves. We have to start protecting, we have to work in parallel to get the protection in place while we build the capacity. But ultimately, this has to be run and owned by Africans themselves. So our hope is that this partnership can come together, mobilize the needed funding, ensure that African governments, funders, both public, private, and corporate, come together with NGOs, that it's focused, and that we use proven management techniques to deliver results. And what I've just said about Africa's population growth, given that, it is absolutely critical that we do this now. We have a window of 10 to 20 years, and if we don't do this in that period of time, we will lose what is just an amazing, valuable resource. When you look in Africa, what you see is that they have already designated something on the order of 8,000 protected areas. And when you read the literature from people like Hank Paulson and others who have looked at what will it cost to protect the biodiversity, they give us numbers about on the range of $20 to $30 billion a year. So what Rob wanted to do was think about, is there a more targeted, focused way that we can address this issue? And can we get there at a different scale and for a different cost? So we developed a set of filters. We looked at that 8,000, and we boiled it down to 164. So if you can get these 164 ecosystems effectively managed, and that's only 6% of the African continent, you can provide the kinds of resources and benefits that is going to be needed for the future of the African population. So what are these? How did we filter this, and how did we get there? Well, we looked at a couple of factors. We looked at size. The average keystone protected area that we're talking about is the size of Yellowstone National Park. So these aren't small, right? We looked at irreplaceability. That is, what's the biodiversity that they have, and if that's lost, can you get it back? We looked at connectivity. How do they connect these ecosystems to the larger landscape that's important? And we looked at integrity. What's the habitat integrity already there? If you have to go in and restore it, it's just a lot more expensive and takes a lot more time. And one of the things I'll point out is that what's so amazing about this ability to focus down is that these 164 keystones provide water for 1 out of 5 Africans. So we're not just talking about nature, we're talking about real ecological benefits and services that are going to be required for the future. Now, these don't just they're not just isolated. And this afternoon, you're going to hear from Greg Carr, who's going to talk about an amazing story of taking one of these places and creating a landscape at scale. And we're talking about doing this across 164. But the Keystone Protected Area is this dark blue in the center. And then it's surrounded by other land use elements that together make up this sort of landscape scale that is required. So in that dark blue, that's where we get pure protection. We try to really restrict activity. In the outside, that's where we talk about sustainable use. And it's this landscape taken together that provides what we need in order to ensure the future. And quite honestly, if we were starting over in the United States, it's how we would have developed. In fact, one of the things that's interesting, I used to work in the Colorado River, and John Wesley Powell, after he made his famous trip down the Colorado River, he looked at those watersheds and he said, you know what? We should develop the West on the basis of ecological boundaries, not on the basis of political boundaries. Of course, we didn't listen to him. We put political boundaries in place, and now we're challenged with seeing whether or not we can maintain enough water in the West for the people and the nature that are there. We already have examples, so that 164 includes somewhere on the order of 40 to 60 protected areas that are already effectively managed. We need to support those going forward, and then we need to bring this other 100 to 120 up to the same standard. And these things can become self-sustaining. So Akagera National Park in Rwanda, it's now producing enough income and revenue that it can support itself. So there's an ability to fund these up front, get them going, build the capacity, and then have them support themselves. So we think that there's real durability in this solution, and we won't require philanthropy forever. Let me just pause. I want to move into management, but let me just pause and see if there's any questions for clarification before I move on. Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about the diversity of the funders coming together on this. How do you go about getting them all involved? Do you convening or fly them all in to come together? There's so many issues in philanthropy. So how do you get that attention for this important initiative?
Right. So you all are the first place we're talking about this, actually, to other donors. And the intent is to actually convene some meetings, probably in Africa, later this year. We're trying to identify, we have about 10 core philanthropists who want to participate. We're trying to grow that. I'm going to talk at the end of this about a new public-private partnership called the U.S. Foundation for International Conservation. So we're trying to figure out how to bring governments in a way that's different. And then how to bring corporates. And it's both the leveraging of these different groups, but I think it's the accountability and the measurability so that we can show real outcomes for the investment that's critical, and the learning. So let me talk about that. Let me shift. So the other thing that's critical here is not only did we filter from 8,000 protected areas down to 164, but we looked across the literature for the management models for how can you do this effectively. And there is something that's called collaborative management partnerships. And these range everywhere from financial and technical support to delegated management. So the financial technical support is one where an organization, for example, Frankfurt Zoological Society, comes in and works with the Tanzanian government in Serengeti, and they're simply the advisors. They provide financial and technical support, and the Tanzanian government runs all of the Serengeti with their advice. Down all the way to delegated management. I mentioned Akagera National Park, African Parks comes in. They get a fully delegated agreement from the government of Rwanda. They manage that entirely. They maintain all the resources. They're responsible for putting the funding back in. And they're also responsible then for developing the capacity of the Rwandan government and the Rwandan manager, so over time they can take it over. And so you see these in different stages. But there's literature from 2021, most recently an article just published last month, that show when you use this approach, you actually get the conservation outcomes. And as a conservationist, I always tell you the one thing that we worry about most in conservation is that all victories are temporary and all losses are permanent. And in this case, we're getting permanent results. So there's a real opportunity. And I just said they're demonstrated, it's documented, there's improved efficiency and accountability with this approach. And importantly, you also have positive impact on people. So you can't do this without the adjacent communities, and Greg's going to really go into that in a lot of detail this afternoon, I'm sure. You also get economic benefits. Rob and I had conversations up in New York during Climate Week with 4 African heads of state. And one of the things they all asked us is, can you help us? We're seeing a rural to urban migration that we can't address. The urban areas are developing way too quickly, and there's not enough livelihood opportunity in the rural areas. With this approach and getting these protected areas effectively managed, you create the opportunity for rural economies and rural development that didn't exist before this. And it's really stark. So the slide on the left is an example of a protected area boundary and a not protected area. And I suspect you can see, without my telling you, which side is the protected area and which isn't. And then the figure on the right is the benefits that you get. So I've mentioned watershed conservation, you get employment and enterprise, you get the rule of law. We were talking with Senator Murkowski about this and explaining some of these things to her, and she pointed out to us, she goes, my God, you're bringing stability, regional and local stability, you're teaching governance, You're giving people small d democracy. You're not just doing conservation. And all of that happens. And a real example of this is, I don't know how many here know of Nando's Peri Peri, a little sauce, right? Nando's. Some people may be investors. So it turns out that in one of the protected areas that we work in, because we were able to bring the community together to get them to start thinking about how they govern the protected area and how they engage, it created an opportunity for Nando to come in and work with the farmers and see if they would be willing to grow the chilies. So they started with 40 farmers. 4 years later, they have 400, and now 30% of the chilies that go into Nando's come out as a community. The private sector came in, no NGO engagement, no NGO responsibility to work on it, and they're now growing their economy at the same time that they're protecting these critical ecosystems. Other questions before I go on? This is a picture, yeah.
Are you looking at smart cities outside the boundaries of what you're talking about in terms of what's going on with your conservation efforts?
Yeah, so we want to focus in on the core key protected areas and find partners who can come in and work in those adjacent areas. Rob's view is, we know what our expertise is, we know the expertise of these conservation groups. Let's get the core secure that creates a foundation, and then we can work with others to come in and work in the adjacent areas for education, for healthcare, for rural development, but that's not the expertise that we have or the conservation groups that we work with. And another thing that we learn out of this, so this slide is a picture of 2 former poachers. So these guys, former poachers, now they work with one of the NGOs and their job is to stop poaching. We do it both with technology. So I'd love to talk to you, Aldo, afterwards. I really want to see how we could partner. But we also do it with people on the ground. And it turns out former poachers know better than anybody where current poachers are going to set the snares, how they're going to do it, who they are, and how to get them out of the community. The thing that was most surprising to me when I met these guys, I asked them, why would you give up poaching? Poaching is incredibly lucrative, right? So 2 reasons. One, as poachers, they didn't have respect in their community. As anti-poachers, they have respect. Secondly, as poachers, they got money in chunks. It came in a bucket. And they got that money in and they didn't know what to do with it, so they spent it. Working for an organization, they get a salary. They now own homes, they're sending their kids to school, they have respect, and they're trying to talk fellow poachers out of poaching. So it's just a remarkable story when you engage the community and bring people together. We want to do this in a way that's business-oriented, so we've developed a set of metrics and learning, bringing people together so that we can learn across these landscapes, so that what a protected area manager figures out how to solve in one area can be shared with another, and we can grow a community and actually create a conservation sector that people want to come into. Critical to all of this is going to be building capacity. So as I said earlier, durability of this is going to require African ownership and that this be done by Africans and African-led. Today, there are not enough African NGOs, nor are there enough African people trained in protected area management or conservation biology. So we want to do 2 things in parallel. Let's get these things protected now. And again, we don't have to designate them, they're already designated. Let's get them effectively managed while we grow the capacity. So we're investing in training academies, and we're also investing in incubator programs. So if you have an international NGO who's already there, rather than take on 5 more protected areas, we're asking you to partner with 5 local NGOs and help them take on 5 more protected areas so they learn how to do it and we can scale the impact. That's part of how we get to the efficiency. So I mentioned that the studies done by Hank Paulson and others suggest that it's $20 to $30 billion a year. Our analysis suggests that middle tranche there, that you can get to effective management of these 164 for $1.25 billion per year. Think about that. $1.25 billion versus $20 to $30 billion. A really great return on investment. We're redoing this analysis with someone who's got a model, and we've gotten data from 40 protected areas, so we'll refine it. but we don't expect it to change much. Now it's for the core, the keystone. So once we work into those adjacent areas, of course, the cost will go up. But for those keystone 164, a remarkable return on investment. This is the Nando's Peri Peri slide. So the slide to my left, I guess that's your right, what he's holding there is what they give them. That is the seed that they put in the ground, and then the other slide is showing them standing in their field of chilies. Remarkable story. And someone else came in and they're now doing rural semi-processing. So they were first selling them to Nando's as raw chilies. Someone else came into the market and said, well, if we dry them out here, you can send the chilies in and you get higher return. So there's a lot that happens once you protect that critical natural infrastructure. Let me pause because I want to flip to one other thing, but see if there's any questions before yeah, in the back.
Excuse my ignorance, but you said poaching is very profitable. Who pays for it? Why is that profitable?
So a lot of it goes into the China market. China's interested in, so if it's the ivory or if it's big game, there's a lot of interest in Asia. If it's bushmeat, it's into the local community, so people will buy that. And so both of those is where the poaching, and you can make a lot of money. $600 for poaching big bushmeat is really a lot for the folks in these communities. The other thing I want to talk about is something that we've been working on for the last 4 years to try to create a new approach in the United States to foreign aid. It's based on an idea that we worked with the German government on called the Legacy Landscapes Fund. And this is to create a new nonprofit in the United States that will be both publicly and privately funded. It passed last year and was signed into law. We're not sure what's going to happen right now with the changes in the US government, but we have been asked by Secretary Rubio to provide him with a memo on it. So we're hopeful that it will sustain and will be funded. But what it does is create a public-private partnership for funding protected and conserved areas. So what I've been talking about in the Keystone. And the way it works is, let's assume that one of these keystones requires $5 million a year to be effectively managed. We don't want to provide all $5 million. We want to provide 30 to 40% of that, because when you give them a fiscal floor, they're able to raise the rest. So this would provide $1 million of government funding, matched by $1 million of private capital, that then leverages another $1 million. And we need to see that 1-to-1-to-1. And the legislation initially provided $100 million a year for 10 years. We'll see it survive, if it survives. But we've got great champions. It was truly bipartisan and bicameral. Lindsey Graham in the Senate was one of the champions, joined by Chris Coons. And then on the House side, it was led by Chairman Mike McCall, who Republican head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Greg Meeks, his Democratic co-partner. And we had a lot of Republicans and Democrats, and supported by an interesting coalition of environmental groups, hunting groups, and interestingly to us, a group that came to us as we were developing this, a group of veterans. So these are military veterans who are now members of Congress, who when they saw this said, you're missing another key element of this. This provides security. We've been in places where we've seen when you have these protected areas effectively managed, the insurgents don't have a place to go. When these parks get hollowed out, especially in Africa, insurgencies come in. So if you go up into the Sahelian region, there are now, I think, approximately 20 Islamic insurgent groups living in these protected areas that are no longer effectively managed. So all of a sudden we had military veterans wanting to join us to advance this legislation, because they'd like to see both the conservation outcomes, the human benefits, and the national security elements. Would love to talk to anybody who wants to join us. We're just at the early stages of trying to launch the partnership, figure out the right way to govern it, and make sure that we make an enduring impact. Thank you very much.